Let me begin by saying that when the journalistic community comes to the scientific community with trust, the communication process through the journalistic community works a whole lot better. And when the public trusts the science journalists to communicate well, then we've got a really nice loop. We founded a new group under factcheck.org called SciCheck, which is going to try to increase the likelihood that good science is communicated well. And we're going to draw a lot on the theories of the social sciences to try to make sure that that happens, and try to draw on what we call the custodians of knowledge. That is, the groups that stand in for science as a whole, such as the National Academy of Sciences, to tell us what it is they know when we're trying to determine what the collectivity that is this community actually knows. Now, I'm going to try to take on the burden of summarizing what I heard yesterday. And because communication doesn't necessarily translate into the audience directly, this is an interpretive analysis of what happened yesterday. It's a kind of free-form Joycean analysis of what happened yesterday. I think we began by defining trust in various ways across the groups, but I've picked up two that I think weren't challenged. I think we agree that, to some extent, trust involves a standing decision to give somebody the benefit of the doubt, and a willingness to open oneself to risk by engaging in a relationship with others. And you can go back and remember who I stole those from yesterday. And in the process, we're assuming the integrity, the dependability, and the competence of somebody else, because we're talking about a relationship or an organization. And we talked about many objects of trust, and I've added the first because I think the nature of the discussion didn't lend itself to putting it there, but I'd like to put it there. I think we talk about trusting those who are the custodians of scientific knowledge, those people who offer us the consensus statements, those who draw the community together to tell us collectively what it knows at key times, often when there's a policy statement at issue or a policy proposal at issue. But we also talked about scientists and whether we trust scientists, and that we talked about that separately from trusting science. And we talked about scientists, we talked about their competence, about whether we trust their competence, whether we trust the information they give us, whether we trust their motives, and whether we trust their capacity to spot and correct their own errors. I drew this out of the slides that asked, what are we surveying when we ask about trust, assuming that the object of the survey was indicating the object of the trust. We also talked about trust in science as a general category, and then science's way of knowing as a kind of subset of that, but you could think of it as separate. We talked about particular areas of science, and then we talked about trusting journalists, but journalists as they're conveying scientific knowledge. I think we made some presuppositions, and I'd like to articulate them so that you can say, no, I didn't presuppose that. I think we presuppose that if you want people to trust science, we should make science trustworthy, and that's actually a direct quote from someone's presentation yesterday. But that means that we have to make sure we've dealt with the problems that the scientific enterprise itself might be experiencing, and try to ensure the scientific enterprise is living up to its norms. And here, groups like Retraction Watch are performing a really important function because they're signaling that there are norms that we need to honor. And we have major scholars who say, wait a minute, those statistics are being misused. That's science talking to science, using the self-corrective norm as the driver to try to ensure that we show that we're dealing with problems and we also deal with problems. And someone used a lovely phrase yesterday, we'd like to create a fabric of trust. That's across all of the various elements and dimensions. It's easier to lose trust than to gain it. 4 different people said some version of that yesterday. So if we want to ask, what do we want for science? We want it to keep the trust it has, and if it goes down a little, we don't ever want it to go down in some way that translates over into the other domain that we call distrust. If you want people to trust science, a number of people said, engage them in participatory understanding. One person said we should engage, not disseminate. I think that also means that when we communicate, we should increase the likelihood of interactivity rather than assuming a passive audience, and someone in effect said that in a presentation. We also said trust is domain-specific, culture-specific, and context-dependent, and that's part of the reason we have so much trouble getting a handle on it. Important distinction yesterday, trust versus distrust. The flip side of trust is betrayal, said one speaker. Distrust should not be understood simply as the absence of or the opposite of trust. You'll get it wrong if you understand it that way. I heard that to say distrust is the byproduct of perceived bad behavior or motives. I think I heard that from Jim Grunig. Negative affect dimensions are sitting under distrust. And I wasn't sure whether speakers were saying in a different way than affective dimensions sit under trust, but the point about affect dimension was made. And a number of people said distrust is more salient than trust because we have negative asymmetry in the way in which we process information. So these are some of the things that I thought I heard yesterday across discussions that bear generally on our question, what is our common conception of trust? I'd like to now shift to ask some questions. How are credibility, trust, parens trustworthiness, and confidence related? The terms were used interchangeably when we talked about the surveys. So if we looked at the surveys and we said, what are the surveys surveying? When they said they were surveying trust, sometimes they were surveying something called confidence. Do we believe confidence and trust are the same thing? Do we theorize them differently? Is one the entailment of the other? And there's an old body of literature. Credibility wasn't mentioned yesterday very much. I think it was mentioned 3 times across the entire discussion, at least in my notes. But do we think that credibility, trust, and confidence are related, or are these things synonyms? And are we telling ourselves something by the fact that across time we've conventionalized these as different words? We use them largely as synonyms when we're talking about synthesizing the survey data. So if we're doing a meta-analysis, we might pull them together. And we use them as synonyms in enough of the discussion to raise the question. I want to just ask a question as someone who studies rhetoric. What does it mean when we say you trust in, or you have confidence in, but there's the credibility of? And I think the fact that the preposition differs is telling us something that's potentially interesting. I'd like you to consider this possibility, that credibility is what resides in what is being evaluated, and in its, that's the institution's, or her, that's the scientist's, message. And that credibility is largely about what's been done in the past and what we have and we're evaluating right now, but it's not usually future tense. So when we're using the word, I think we are making a different kind of cognitive move. But trust is relational. Go back to the earlier definition, and there's an element of future trust, future tense in trust. There's an anticipation that the relationship is consequential and that I need to have this element in play, trust, so that in the unanticipated circumstance, or in the circumstance that I'm not completely able to understand, but that might nonetheless affect me or society, I can assume that that person, given some authority, will act in the best interest either of me or of society as a whole. I think confidence is the byproduct and resides in the evaluator. I have confidence in, the locus of confidence is in me as an individual, and I think the relationship among them is mutually reinforcing. Now, I don't know that this is anything but a linguistic exercise, but to the extent that we say it this way, I think we ask questions differently. For a moment, let me go back to some very old literature. Aristotelians talk about ethos, and we quickly translated that into English as credibility. Ethos largely resided in the speaker. It was an intrinsic characteristic. It was something that you brought to the act of speaking in the agora. And so it was your character as an individual. Character was often used as a kind of substitute, a telegraphic substitute. And to the extent that you were a person of goodwill and integrity, that's quintillion, you would increase your ethos. You would trust someone because up to that point, all of those things came together, and you knew that when that person was there, that person had credibility. It was a characteristic of the source. There also is, in the early theorizing, the idea that some messages are going to increase the ethos of the source. But it's not highly developed. But early in the literature, when you're studying credibility, the assumption is that that person is credible because of the biographical description we've attributed to the individual, and that person is not because of the biographical description. One question: if the messenger and message can contain cues that undercut credibility, and I think we all grant that they can, then aren't there cues that can, at least in some circumstances, increase credibility of the messenger and the message? Historically, we've spent time talking about the credibility and the characteristics of the messenger. We've spent less time talking about the characteristics of the credibility of the message. And if we've got this relational notion among those three concepts, then credibility pushes us to ask about the messenger and the message, while trust asks us about the relationship, and confidence asks what is engendered as a result in the audience as a result of those interplays, and there's a feedback loop among them. Susan Fiske and colleague said something very important in Sackler Colloquium, then published in PNAS. She reminded us that science communication, like other communication, needs to convey communicator warmth, trustworthiness, as well as competence, expertise, in order to be credible. Now notice, needs to communicate. Needs to convey communicator warmth. That concept is related in an understanding of a communicator-message relationship in relationship to the audience. And it should assume that there are some cues that are capable of communicating that. Let me step back and ask, well, what can we learn from political communication scholars about how we do this and how we assess that? Now we're in an area I've done a lot of work in. We elect presidents to act in unanticipated circumstances. We trust that in those circumstances, and that's what we mean when we say we trust them, we trust that they're going to act in ways that are consistent with their messaging. We trust that they have the character and temperament to stand in for us in an important way and use values consistent with ours in order to act in those unanticipated circumstances in ways consistent with their promises, assuming that the promises should not be broken because there isn't new information. But we trust their intelligence and competence and their integrity to say to us, circumstances have changed, and that promise I articulated is no longer something I want to act on or should act on, and as a result, because you should trust my biography, my background, everything that you build into the source-message relationship through history, tells you that in this circumstance, I am acting in your best interest. That's my understanding of what it means to say that we elect people we perceive to be strong leaders who are perceived to be competent. Now notice, you can be a strong leader and not necessarily competent. We actually have some different loadings between the two, although they're really tightly related. Somebody could just go charging off and be really, really strong, but they could be wrong. Pause. Honest and trustworthy. Strong leader plus honest or trustworthy, and those aren't exactly synonyms. There's a little different loading in those. Honest resides more so in the person and the person's past activities. Trustworthy has this going forward element in it, but they really load together pretty nicely. But you care about people like me. That is, you're not going to act in the self-interest of a different group of people because you don't understand that I'm there or you don't understand me, and you share my values. And it's really helpful if in the process you're likable, in part because that ensures the likelihood that I believe you and you show that you care about people like me and you assert that you share my values. Now, what does all of this say? It says that's a very complex composite of things that intersect the biography and past, what the classics would have called ethos, with the message structures, because the message structures are forecasting future action, with the relationship that licenses the person to act in unanticipated circumstance and has confidence that in the end, the well-being of the individual and the collective whole is going to be preserved, in large part because shares my values and cares about people like me are still in there. Now go back to Fisk. Why is warmth, trustworthiness inside her set of dimensions, and it's sitting right here about the presidency? It's for the same reason. Those are linkage points that help you translate shares my values into confidence that someone will act in order to protect your best interest in unanticipated circumstances, circumstances that involve risk, circumstances in which you want ethical behavior, even though a competent individual could act to produce a scientific outcome, but you want the barriers put in place because of the value structures that you share. My second point, and this is really important, what the classics got wrong, they made the assumption that credibility resided there, it stayed there, it was a given, and didn't take into account that audiences might perceive all of this differently based on their cultural differences and all sorts of other differences, their ideological differences, their religious differences. But we know in politics that there's variability in perception of these things across time in political candidates, with the lesser known candidate more subject to variability across time. Hence, the person who is unknown is able to be characterized by the person who is better known's advertising, particularly if there's disproportionate spending, and can put traits in place, ascribed characteristics in place, but also can shift them across time. And what that variability across time tells us is that there is some possibility that if someone says, I trust you, and there are these kinds of dimensions sitting under there in some general way, you might be able to take that away from them. We saw that with Al Gore in 2000. We know that you can change it across time because the National Annenberg Election Survey is a rolling cross-sectional methodology, and as a result, we can watch day-to-day variability in the presence of a stimulus. The stimulus in the 2000 election were ads suggesting that Al Gore believed he invented the internet and was taking credit for it, and a series of other ads attacking his trustworthiness. As the volume of the ads increased, the perception of trustworthiness decreased. What does that mean? Al Gore was a pretty well-known person. It means there's messaging that is capable of pushing these things around across time. And we also have every reason to believe that news structures and access to news information can do the same thing, because news structures, among other things, can set different agendas and can prime different characteristics of evaluation, and by priming different characteristics, can get different evaluative results. So we can't assume you're going to keep the trustworthiness you've got, but we can also assume that you might be able to push it up or pull it down. Scientists are seen as competent but cold, tells us Susan Fiske and her colleagues, and she worries about that because she believes that warmth and trustworthiness co-vary and they're going to ultimately drive trust. The political literature is consistent with that realization. That's why that statement by Fiske included "like other communicators" in it. We know the traits can be primed in politics. You, in 2004, can prime that George Bush is stubborn or George Bush is resolute. And each campaign engages in a contest to see which they can get you to accept. We are now in a contested domain in some areas of scientific inquiry in which the adjectival trait characteristics imputed to scientists are at issue. But this is about scientists in a specific area and not necessarily about science in general. Remember that first slide that said it's trust about. There are all these different kinds of domains. And there aren't people out there who are questioning the scientific method. They are questioning whether scientists are living up to the scientific method, which means the trust is still there in the method, but they're accusing the scientists of a failure to meet a norm, and in fact, of a kind of hypocrisy. If we understand the difference between those, we're going to make different assessments about what people are saying when they say, I don't trust the scientist or the science in this particular area, or I'm worried about science writ large because it appears to have an irreproducibility problem, or attraction problem, a peer review problem. Those things would suggest that the integrity of the scientific enterprise, as manifest in the integrity, trustworthiness, honesty of a specific set of scientists, or a specific scientist, depending on how many have published the article, has not lived up to what we would expect. I can tell you across political campaigns that the negative priming of characteristics is much easier to do than positive priming. I can also tell you that in the face of rebuttal, another side, the negative traits are going to win out over the positive traits. And if there's a message imbalance, you're more likely to get the advantage doubled up for the negative traits. The negative asymmetry of information works powerfully here. What does that mean? When there is an attack on science and no response, we are running the risk that we put the negative attributions in place without the positives contesting with it. And as a result, we increase the likelihood that they stick. The same thing with specific instances of the scientific enterprise in some specific area, when it faces, for example, something that some call climate gate. We're now in a contested area in which we run the risk that we are priming up certain characteristics in an area in which the public doesn't know as much as it should about how science operates, and as a result we get attitude shifts that ultimately erode the thing that we are calling trust, but I'm actually calling a credibility, trust, confidence relationship. We know that you can prime out of touch fairly easily about politicians. How does that translate into science? Yeah, they're great in the lab, they just don't get the real world and they're really messing things up. You can prime flip-flopper. What does that mean? Inconsistency in what someone is doing across time. You also can prime personal kinds of characteristics. I just threw this in because we have really good data on it. You can prime up McCain's age and you can increase the likelihood that people vote against him. And of course, you can prime up untrustworthiness. That's the Al Gore example. Next point. We know from social science, this is Cacioppo and his colleagues a long time ago, that you can activate identity or self-schemas in audiences. And I'm going to generalize from that to say that are more or less receptive to science. So what the Cacioppo study did was activated an identity of religious person as opposed to legal person, and then legal person as opposed to religious person. Now, we all have alternative identities. We can prime up one and suppress others. We do it all the time. I'm talking to you as a colleague. I'm not talking to you as a mother, a daughter. I'm not talking to you as a specialist in some very specific kinds of areas. I know a lot about papal rhetoric, by the way. I just tried to prime that up. When we prime up the self-schema of the audience and we give the audience cues that we as the source are partisan, because it seems as if we have a horse in the race, because it seems as if we're not accounting for all the available data. And we invite the move from the behavior, why didn't you account for that data, to the question, why didn't you? And now we are ascribing motive. Once you move to ascribing motive, if the motive of the scientist is anything other than seeking knowledge because that is desirable and what the person is motivated to want to do, and grapple with all of its complexities, including its limitations, if we've primed up something other than that, we run the risk that what we say is the scientist is just another form of advocate who is selectively using evidence in order to engage in a persuasive campaign. To the extent that in the audience we prime up, you're a partisan because you're listening to a partisan, we're going to have real difficulty having people confront evidence that's incongenial to ideology. But just as I worry about having people believe that credibility is intrinsic in people, I worry that we now are tending to talk in some places as if being a partisan is hardwired into some people, and as if they are incapable of moving into other kinds of space in which they're information seekers who weigh as best they can the evidence to try to find out what we know. I think you can flip off the partisan switch fairly easily in some cases. Imagine that you've got a diagnosis that you've got cancer. The first thing you do is not consult Rachel Maddow or Rush Limbaugh. The first thing that you do is try to figure out what the scientists know as best they can with all the limitations, and you go to someone you trust with expertise in medicine. And you try to find out what credentials would equal expertise in medicine. And then you ask this question, doctor, if I were your wife or your daughter, what would you ask me to do? We ask the person to perform a surrogacy function for us. And I think that's part of what we mean when we say trust is relational. We are trusting the person who is being asked, is asking us to understand and accept something. If you were in my shoes, what would you want us to do? Because we assume that you share my values and you care about people like me, which is why I worry when we take the value and caring dimension out and talk about science as if those things aren't actually there. I think they're intrinsic in most human communication processes. So I think it's possible to activate in the audience different kinds of schemas, and when science speaks with a certain kind of voice, it activates one, and when it speaks with another kind of voice, I think it activates another. And when it activates the cues to you that you are supposed to act in a partisan way, I think you predictably do act in a partisan way. Some people more so than others, they're more disposed to be partisans. But I think there's a capacity to switch that off. My colleague and Bruce Hardy and I tried to demonstrate that in the presentation that I delivered at the Sackler Colloquium, an article we then published in PNAS. We tried to show that given selective use of data that invited one ideologically congruent interpretation from conservatives, we could actually expose to compelling data, visuals from NASA that appeared to support that interpretation, and we could turn it around by involving the audience in a participatory interaction with the data with a neutrally voiced science behind it, neutrally voiced scientist, science voice behind it, and relying on the credibility of an institutional source, custodian of knowledge, NASA, that both conservatives and liberals tell the Pew Charitable Trust in their surveys that they trust. So if we can make that switch off on something as powerful as a Fox News primed use of two NASA images, I think we can do it elsewhere. I just don't think that we have used the voice often enough that lets us make the switch. Questions. How does one increase the credibility of the voice of science, and what source and message cues increase credibility? That's the research question. Here's one answer that I heard. I don't know how we're going to increase the oxytocin levels, but if we could, we would possibly increase the likelihood that we'd have trust in the person who you're proximate with at that point who's offering you the message. So when I go back to this, what am I trying to ask? What is the rhetorical equivalent of increasing the oxytocin levels? I think the rhetorical equivalent in the voice of science is ensuring that the voice is dispassionate, but cares about knowledge, hence isn't cold, cares about knowing as best he or she can, carefully specifies the limits of what the person knows, because doing so establishes that the person is following science's norms. And it also avoids the move to question the person's motives. And at the same time, trusts the audience enough to assume that the audience can understand the science, at least to the extent that the person needs to in order to engage in a public debate. I think sometimes the public hears the voice of science as a disdainful voice, a voice that says, we would like to tell you that we have a consensus, now accept it. Well, that's an appeal to authority. And I have a visceral reaction to appeals to authority. Remember I told you I'm an expert in the Catholic papacy? Wrote my doctoral dissertation on the birth control encyclical Humanae Vitae and its reception in the modern world. Modern world doesn't react well to appeals to natural law and authority. Modern world reacts well, I think, particularly in the environment that we're in, the multimedia environment that we're in, to a voice that lets the audience participate in the process of understanding and draw its own conclusions with the help of the scientist, who can be there to be trusted for all the things that the scientist can't actually communicate well, all the technicalities. And in many things, the public doesn't need to understand, because it's not, the issue is not involved in a public debate. But when it is, I think that's the way we do this. And to the extent that that voice isn't trusted as being a dispassionate voice that cares about knowledge and cares about confronting disconfirming evidence, because that's what science does, I think the scientist has more trouble entering those debates and being effective in the policy arena and in increasing public understanding. And I think there are source cues that communicate that and message cues. I think the message cues are cues that adhere to the norms of science. I just spent some time the other night in the DVAS lecture articulating what those are, and so I'm not going to go on to them at this point. But I'm going to encourage you, whenever this thing is published in Science and Technology, to please take a look at it and email me with any suggestions. I'm also going to ask that if you have any instances of science you think abused in public domain, you please email me for factcheck.org, and SciCheck will take a look at them. And if you've got some science that you think needs to be checked, I hope you'll let us know as well. And failing all of that, I think we need to find a way to increase the oxytocin levels in the audience, and as a result, just assume that we're going to get trust biologically and not through the process of communication. I'd be happy to listen to your comments. And for all those things that I didn't synthesize well, please feel free to say, wait a minute, you missed something important.
So that was a real tour de force, Kathleen, and I'm going to take a few minutes here to take questions or comments or observations from the audience before I introduce our maitre d'hotel for the breakout session. So questions, comments, please. Microphones on either side. Declan.
Hi, Professor Jamieson. My question is about the transference of ideas from political communication to science communication, and whether what are the implications for trust? Should scientific or science communication be seen to be undergoing the same amount of testing, analysis, sort of manufactured messaging that goes on in political communication that has implications for trust in politics?
Yeah. I believe in message testing of complex messages, and I don't think there's any problem in doing it. And I don't think that what we are seen to be doing is trying to increase the understandability of what it is we're trying to communicate. I don't think there's a problem in the public perception when the public learns that we are trying to increase the likelihood that we've got public comprehension. I think if the public thinks that what we're trying to do is to engage in a persuasive process of altering the debate as a result of testing, we've got a problem. And there, politicians and scientists diverge. Politicians are not trying to find out how best to communicate to you what you need to know in order to become an informed electorate. If they were, that would be fine. They're trying instead to figure out what it takes to effectively communicate whatever it takes to get them elected. So the missions are fundamentally different. The process of testing to find out what works is not a process that's tainted by virtue of the process that is trying to find out how audiences receive messages. And I think sometimes the scientific community engages in a technical vocabulary and doesn't hear the way in which the public hears the message. And as a result, the public is confused. I said the other night, I really worry that the CDC declared in 2000 that measles had been eliminated, because the public thinks eliminated means we've gotten rid of it, no longer cause for concern, and hence, why do I need to be vaccinated is a possible inference. So I made the statement the other night in the DBAS lecture that the CDC shouldn't use the word eliminated and make a distinction between eliminated and eradicated. Eliminated meaning you've gotten it out of a geographic locale for a specific period of time. Eradicated meaning you've gotten it out, period. Now, if it's eliminated by the CDC definition, it still can come across borders because it's still out there, so you can still catch the measles, and as a result, you still need to make sure you've got vaccination. So having made the statement on Tuesday, the CDC, and remember we're worried about mumps, measles, and rubella because of the autism link spuriously created by the Wakefield study, increasing the likelihood that people thought that vaccination was going to hurt their kids. So I worried, we've got one piece of that, measles, and CDC said eliminate it, and out here you got some people who think, and I don't want to do it anyway because of autism. We're trying to take that one down to say, no, science has not found that association. That was bogus. And so Thursday, after I gave the lecture Tuesday, the CDC announced that we've eliminated rubella. All we have to do now is have the CDC announce that we've eliminated mumps, and we can do a beautiful study in which we look at first the impact of perception of eliminating measles, then perception of eliminating mumps, co-varying with perception that there's this bogus autism link, perception there's a link that is bogus, and then see what happens if they eliminate measles. This is one of those instances in which message testing would have helped, at least to tell the CDC that we're not talking the same language. Somebody said lingua franca the other day. We need a lingua franca. We need a common language. So to the extent that we test when we're not sure about what the public gets it, I don't see any problem. I think it's desirable, honorable behavior that we should publicly stand up and defend anytime it's asked or questioned.
Other questions, comments? Kathleen, thank you so very, very much. That was outstanding.
Thank you.